Dr. Jazz.
Like I said,
Jazz.
you must have an interesting story, like coming from Australia, well, now in Thailand, in between New York. Then I have you on a couple of albums with English musicians, so it's I'm puzzled now how all this happened. But I wanted to first ask
Yeah,
you.
it's a long story. I'll try to make it brief as possible.
But
My father's a musician.
yeah, I wanted to go back just to start with how did you get in jazz? I mean, like, I know Australian jazz a little bit, but how was it in, let's say, mid or late 70s when you were kind of diving into
bizarre, man. It's bizarre. I mean, Australia's a lost island somewhere in the South Pacific on the way to Antarctica. It's as far as you can go without, it's a long way away. I mean, basically 250 years ago, they weren't even sure where Australia was. It didn't exist on any of the known seafaring maps of the British or anybody particularly. So they weren't really sure that Australia even existed 250 to 300 years ago. They really didn't know that Australia was really there or not. So yes, it's a very new-ish country. It's English speaking. It's a bit like America in so many ways because it has a cowboy culture. It has indigenous people, although they're black Aboriginal people. It has there's many parallels with Australia and America in so many ways. Therefore, we grew up with jazz as well. Jazz was very big in Australia for a really long time. About half of Australia's history, in fact. Federation was 1901, and jazz was always around, and so. Basically, yeah, for half Australia's history, it was a jazz history in so many ways. And it's interesting because I just lived in Australia all my life as a kid, grew up there, running around with the kangaroos and swimming and surfing and doing all that kind of stuff. But my father was a jazz musician. He was a saxophone player and clarinetist. That was clarinet was the big horn in those. Yes, he was a very good clarinetist. He was a good saxophone player. Very talented. He had great ears, but in those days you had to repair. In Australia, you had to repair all the instruments yourself, do everything yourself. It was hard, So we had a workshop downstairs with all the pads and all of the bits and pieces. We used to do that. When I grew up, we had piano. My mum played piano, and we had a couple of pianos downstairs, and we had a drum kit and tons of other instruments that my father had collected over the years from various other musicians, and some of the things just sat there collecting dust. But he was a real collector. We had two baritone saxophones, about 3 sopranos, about 6 different altos, about 8 different tenors. We had bass clarinets. We had clarinets. We had a flute collection from all over the world: African, Balinese, Indonesian, from everywhere. We had so there were lots of instruments around the house. My grandfather was a drummer, and he was more of a traditional jazz style drummer, but very good. And in Australia in those days, you had to do lots of other things to make a living. You couldn't really make that much money out of music. It wasn't reliable anyway. So it was an interesting upbringing because I heard a lot of the records. My father had quite a collection. When I was growing up, Eric Dolphy, Outward Bound, Bill Evans, Live at the Village Vanguard, Charles Mingus, Miles Davis, Working, Cooking, Relaxing, Steamin', Gil Evans, Sketches of Spain. There were lots. There was Nancy Wilson. There was Ella Fitzgerald. All the Frank Sinatra, all the big band stuff, Count Basie. That was very popular back then. And there was there was work. There were gigs and clubs in Australia. There were lots and lots of clubs. all of the musicians seemed to be working at one stage. By the time I grew up, they were doing really well. They were going. My father was always going out every night in his dinner suit with his Pinkman suit with a black bow tie. And a lot of the gigs I did back then were all of that stuff. I started when I was really young. I played a variety of instruments. I played bass and I played flute and I played saxophone and clarinet. And I played a bit of piano and everything. But you know, I was just like a normal kid, really. I just thought everybody played music until I got to a certain age, and I realised that not everybody did. So maybe I could make a living out of it. And so I just kept going. In Australia, it was interesting because you get a variety of different experiences because you have to work as a musician. So within a week, you might play with a rock and roll band. One night you might play with a really nice big band. The next night, reading all the charts. Then the next night you might do a great jazz gig with a quartet. The next night you might play with a funk band or with a singer. So everybody had a wide variety of experiences playing with lots of different lineups all of the time. You had to make a living in Australia, writing music, copying charts for bands. That was all a big industry. We had the club scene, football clubs, and also return services clubs, which is the army.
Yeah.
And we had those clubs, and that was a circuit around Australia. Each one of them had a band. 7 nights a week with a big band. That's what my father did when I was growing up, and he made a good living out of it. And all the guys in the band, that was for 11 years. I think they all bought houses and stuff. You just cannot do that anymore.
No, sure.
So there was a circuit around Australia. So we had a lot of people visiting at one stage. When I was growing up, I went to see these in Sydney. I lived in Sydney as a kid. When I was still at school, I was with a youth big band called the Young Northside Big Band, and that was the first youth big band in Australia. I was one of the featured soloists, and a trumpet player or trombonist then called James Morrison, who's pretty well known. He was James Morrison.
Sure. No, yeah, amazing.
He was in the Young Northside Big Band too. It was the first and only youth big band at the time, but because there was only one, it was pretty good considering it was the first one. And we had some great arrangements by some fantastic musicians with great imagination and abilities, and great encouragement from everybody. I recorded two albums with that band, and we toured the States at one stage, and that's when I first went to New York. So I was pretty young when I went, and I thought it was amazing. I'd never been able, Australia was. I think it was my first. I'd been to New Zealand and Bali with my parents years ago or something when I was a kid because they're very close. But it was the first time I'd been significantly out of Australia by myself. With as a musician playing with the youth band. We did the college tour. We did the Monterey Jazz Festival. We did a few gigs, but we didn't. New York wasn't on the touring agenda. So me and a few others, we jumped ship. We weren't supposed to, but we ran away because I wanted to see New York while I was in the States, and that just wasn't in the touring map at all for us. So I thought, oh, come on, I've got to go to New York. So we decided to run away, which was very bad. We got in a lot of trouble because, they were looking after us. We were just kids, but we ran away to New York, and it was one of the best decisions we ever made. New York was popping then. It must have been 1978 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And it was summer. So we had you had the Jazzmobile concerts all around New York, all around Manhattan. We saw Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, which I played with later. I remember it distinctly. It was Art Blakey with Valerie Ponomarev on trumpet, with David Williams on the piano, with Dennis Irwin on the bass, David Schnitter on the saxophone.
That lineup,
it was great, man. We heard the Johnny Griffin Band with Ray Drummond on the bass and Idris Muhammad on the drums, and we heard the Mel Lewis Big Band, which was just fantastic, dynamite. And I remember this young saxophone player that was kind of weird, but he sounded really good and totally different to anyone else. And I thought, wow, this guy's, I don't know who he is. He's playing second alto, but he sounds really good. And I went, I was really keen on hearing this guy. His name was Steve Coleman. Steve Coleman. So nobody had ever heard of Steve Coleman then. And Joe Lovano. and Joe Lovano was on the saxophone. Yeah, I'm serious. Nobody heard him. Just a young kid, just 1978. And Joe Lovano's a completely new thing. And, you know, they made some great recordings with that band. We heard the Sun Ra Big Band at the... I can't remember the Hub Cinema, the Hub Theatre, the Sun Ra Big Band, and it was just a dramatic spectacle. It was as visual as it was musical, and costumes, and the whole chanting thing was just sensational. We heard Phil Woods at the Village Vanguard. One of the guys was a Phil Woods fan, so he went and heard Phil Woods, and that was great. That was a really good band. His classic band. We went and heard. We heard the Red Garland Trio.
Oh wow, beautiful!
And that was sensational. Red Garland was still alive. Went to his trio, and Junior Cook sat in, and George Coleman sat in. So, from the perspective of a tenor saxophone player at the time,
that must have been
it was fantastic. But you know, it was an amazing experience in New York. I found it very friendly, very fun, open all night, 24 hours. And everybody was really encouraging and really enthusiastic. I just loved the place. I thought, I've got to make it back here. Because I'm from Sydney. In Sydney, Australia, there's an area called King's Cross. There's one in London too. Half of the things in Australia are named after England because it was, you know, taken over by the English, colonised by the English. So there's a lot of English place names. But King's Cross is where all the red light district is in Sydney. And it's 24 hours. It used to have jazz clubs all up and down the strip. And it had a lot of the American troops, always, the docks were just down the hill, the Navy docks. So all that time during the Vietnam War and before that, the Korean War, all of the American ships used to stop there and all the troops would come up and have lots of fun at King's Cross. So King's Cross had that atmosphere, 24 hours, food everywhere, you know, all of the venues where they had jazz. It was the Texas Tavern, the Beefsteak and Bourbon, you know, very American names. There was lots of the Persian Room and the Paradise Room and all these places that were, and they were 24 hours. And, you know, I had gigs there starting at 3 a.m. sometimes. Shit. Because we still had an audience. We had people that used to come down and dig the jazz. And because it was down by the docks, you know, a lot of the cruise ships had bands. And so a lot of the musicians, they used to come up and hang out at the jazz clubs, sit in at the jazz clubs. There were some fantastic players. So that was a really great time and a really great training ground for me. But it was, when I got to New York, I thought, this is just one big King's Cross. The whole island is like King's Cross. It felt instantly familiar. It felt like the red light district of Sydney, but spread over an entire island. So I thought, oh, this is too much fun. This is great. I've got to be here. So eventually, after I finished I did a jazz course at Sydney University.
Oh, okay.
Just a diploma course years ago. It was the only course there was. It was started by an American guy, and when I did that, they had the Jamie Abersole course. Jamie Abersole came out 2 years in a row, and that was sort of a big thing, new thing for Australia, because he had all these really good players come with him, and they all played. They all brought their bands with them and all played. We had Dave Liebman, John Schofield, we had Steve Swallow, we had the whole Woody Shaw band with Mulgrew Miller on the piano, Stafford James on bass, Tony Lewis on drums, Steve Toure on trombone. We had all of Freddie Hubbard's band, Freddie Hubbard on the trumpet, Victor Lewis on the drums, bass player, but his whole band. We had Sonny Stitt came out. I played with Sonny Stitt when I was 17 in Australia. I was always being pushed out by agents. You know, someone had come to Australia. Everyone had toured Australia at that stage because I think the Australian dollar was $1.25 to $1 American, $1.25 Australian to $1 American. So it was very easy to get all the good American bands to Australia, and we had them all. Sonny Stitt, Johnny Griffin's band, Joe Henderson, Freddie Hubbard, Herbie Hancock. They all came to Australia. Wow. They all appeared in Sydney, and they played in jazz clubs. But when the Jamie Abersol Clinic came out, they were all around for a week. So we had a chance to talk to them all, get lessons from them all, and to hang out with them more importantly.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, like, you know, you were saying about US musicians coming. Was there like a jazz circuit in a sense that, you know, people play it in Brisbane and Melbourne and Perth and Sydney, or just like Sydney?
Well, Australia's a really big place, right? So from Sydney, it takes an hour to fly to Brisbane, and it takes an hour, and that's going north, and going down south, it takes an hour to fly to Melbourne. From Sydney to Adelaide takes about 3 hours to fly. From Sydney to Perth takes about five and a half hours, depending on which direction. So it's a big country, you know. It's technically about almost identical area-wise to the United States. Funnily enough, too, it's very, very similar dimensions, very similar, different topography, culture, many things. But basically, it's about that size. So, and Australia has a relatively small population. So, but there is a touring circuit. Yes, when the bands came to Australia, they used to do concerts in all of the major cities, and you know, that was it. So they play in Sydney, they play Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, Darwin. Sometimes they play in Canberra, which is the national capital. So yes, and that continued for many years. I tried to develop a circuit there as well with some others too. We had, now this is the amazing thing about Australia, we had something called the jazz coordinator, the national jazz coordinator, the national jazz coordinating office, and we had a state jazz coordinator for each state. Oh, wow. And their job was to assist jazz musicians. We had government grants, and whatever grants were available, they'd let everybody know, and they'd help you fill out the applications. They'd assist you in organising a tour overseas, say to Europe or Japan or Southeast Asia. So there was a pretty good setup, and that's one thing that was good about Australia, that's compensated for the tyranny of distance a little bit, that made it a little bit easier to get around, despite the fact that it was very isolated and you know, hard to get around mostly. So we did everything we possibly could to make that easier for everybody and to make it more available for people. It was a pretty good time. But yes, me and others helped try to develop that circuit, and the National Jazz Committee, the organisation and office, they did things like got special subsidies from the airlines to fly jazz musicians around with their bands, so they could get the equipment on the plane without any problem, and all of that sort of thing. They'd help with assist with accommodation, organising things on the ground. It was very, very good. It was more like a Northern European country, saying like the Danish Jazz Federation, or
Norwegian,
what's the one in Holland, the BIM House, which has a similar kind of functional branch that helps all of the musicians and helps the bands organise tours. I mean, you know, it was jazz musicians. We do need a little bit of help. We think about the music.
Definitely.
You know, I've got these tunes going through my head. I'm trying to learn all the songs, learn all the changes, some new original that the guitarist has written. And, you know, in the meantime, I'm supposed to be thinking about, you know, who we're going to meet on the ground, which hotel we're going to stay up and stay, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So it's good that you have some sort of help.
Sure, man. Yeah. Sure.
We all needed it very much. But yeah, that was very, very good. And, you know, but that was mainly when I got back to Australia after having been in New York. I went to New York. I moved there after I finished studying in Australia.
When was that? Which year?
Oh, that was about 81, I think.
How was that like for you when you came?
Beginning of 82.
When you moved to New York? When you moved to New York, you know, what was it like for you as an Australian, you know, entering the New York scene? I mean, I guess the only guy I know from Australia who was then in New York was Mike Knock, but
yes, well, Mike is a very good friend of mine. I love Mike. I'm a huge admirer of his composition and his comping piano playing. He's beautiful, and he lives near me in Sydney. That's a weird thing. I see him at the shops.
Oh, really? Say hi to him.
Sydney. Yeah.
You see him?
Yeah, he just lives around. He's married to a beautiful Japanese lady. Yeah. He still lives there and does his thing. But you know, it's interesting because when I first got the gig with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, Mike was the first guy I called. He was still, he just moved back to Australia, and I had just done an album with him. He played on my album, one of my first albums, and I loved all the stuff that he'd done. And I thought, Mike knows, he's the one guy that knows the New York scene in Australia that I can think of. So I'm going to call Mike, and I called him and said, hey, Mike, I think I just got the gig with the Messengers. And we had a rave. He said, oh, congratulations, that's great, and, you know, all of that stuff. So, yeah, he's always been just a magic man for me. Fantastic. Really a great inspiration musically and philosophically in many different ways. And yes, he's the one guy that was there for many, many years. So when I talk to Mike, he can understand all the experiences. You know, he knows a lot of the cats that I know from New York. And, you know, when I mentioned the cats I was playing with, oh, how's so-and-so and how's this guy and that guy? You know, it's amazing. He was there for a really, really long time, playing with some great bands that did some amazing things. In fact, in America, I was really surprised because I ended up playing with some cats from Portland, Oregon. There was a whole crew of dudes there, really good players from Portland. Jim Pepper, saxophone player, who was a bit of a mentor of mine, Native American Indian guy, was pretty famous. He used to play with I played with Don Cherry, and he played with Paul Motion's band, the original one, and he had a few hits when he was. You know, I got to know all those guys.
Wichita, I mean Wichita and Coming and Going and that stuff.
Yeah,
I love that stuff, man.
Wichita, exactly. Yeah. So you know, I spent a lot of time hanging out with Jim, and he was a great inspiration for me. A good mate too. He was wonderful. But you know, Mike Knock was from that sort of era, and it's amazing. Like in the States, a lot of the guys from the West Coast remember his band, The Fourth Way, I think it was called.
The fusion,
and that's actually credited with as being the first jazz fusion band, like you know, before Weather Report. It's amazing. But I didn't even know that before I moved to the States. But a lot of people there know of Mike Knock and you know, remember Mike Knock from the 60s when he was first there. So he made an impact. He was wonderful, man, absolutely fantastic. But again, he was the only guy that was in Australia at the time that I could really call and talk to about the New York scene, because he really, at that stage, he was the only cat who'd ever really lived there. But you know, he's not even Australian. He's from New Zealand.
New Zealand, I know. Yeah,
he's a New Zealander. But you know, Australia and New Zealand, they're, you know, kind of like you know, two provinces of the same country. People basically sound the same, and then it's all very familiar. There's a reciprocal thing going on with New Zealand and Australia. So if you're a New Zealander, you can come to Australia, do everything an Australian can, and the reverse is true. So you can buy a house, you can do everything but vote. You can get social welfare straight off the plane if you catch a plane to Australia, and vice versa in New Zealand. So it's a very open policy. It's like no borders. There's not really any borders at all between New Zealand and Australia in any way.
EU, so, the European Union, in a sense.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, it's always been that way. So you know, when things are really good in Australia, all the New Zealanders move over. And when things are really good in New Zealand, all the Australians move over. Exactly.
No, but when you came to New York in 1981, I mean, how was that like for you? I mean, who were the first people you hooked up with, and you know, how did you start actually there? I mean,
well, I just hooked up with other Australians at first. That was the thing. There was quite a few Australians living there. A couple of guys my age, Dave Finecki, trombone player, and there was Dave Addis, the saxophone player, and they were doing gigs on the New York scene, or you know, doing what they could to get by. You know what it's like as a musician. You know, people drive taxis, they do deliveries, they work as cooks in restaurants, they do various things to survive. And I did a little bit of that too. I've done my fair share of all of that stuff as well, because I was really determined to live there and stay there. I loved the place so much, and so I just stayed with Australians until I got myself settled and found my own way. So yeah, the Australians really helped me out when I was first there. And then I just got around. I did exactly the same as everybody does in New York. I took lessons off people. I took piano lessons, saxophone lessons. I studied writing with Bob Brookmeyer and Manny Album. Wow. I did the BMI Rangers course. I studied. I learned with George Coleman, Dave Liebman. I took lessons from Steve Grossman. I took a lesson from James Moody. I took the Barry Harris lessons. I went to Barry Harris's Jazz Cultural Theatre on 28th Street. I got a year's membership. It was all owned by Panonica, of course, Nika Van Koningswater. Monk has written about and wrote songs about Horace Silver, Nika's Dream, etc. So I met her a few times. That was pretty awesome, and just hanging out there, just learning from everybody, going to jam sessions, getting to know people. And I think when I was there, one of the best things about New York was the fact that there was music on the streets, and that was very special to me, and it was really good music too. Yeah, it was allowed. There was no law against it. And you could make some money because it was full of tourists all the time. So you could set up a band around 42nd Street where they sell the cheap tickets in the middle of the 42nd Street there, and you'd have a significant amount of tourists, and you'd set up the drum box in front or a hat or something, and someone would take the hat around, and people would, and you'd make money. I mean, they'd fill up with dollar bills really quickly. People would be incredibly generous, and after a while, it got really popular, and there was no restriction on it. The police hadn't stopped it at that stage, and so I would go out there and I would play for 8 hours, sometimes 12 hours. We'd have a break for some coffee and pizza, and then we'd go back and play again. And these guys are really serious about it. When I first got to New York, I called up a whole bunch of people and said, "Oh, I'm in town," and a couple of guys said, "Oh, look, I'll call around and see, and help you out a little bit." And I got a call from a drummer and said, "Look, I want to book you tomorrow at 9 a.m. for a gig." And I go, "Oh, that's good. Whereabouts?" It's on the street. It's with my band. We started exactly 9 a.m. and no later. And we'll just keep playing until maybe late afternoon or early evening. Oh, gee, that's unusual. Let's check this out. So I think I got up late, and I got there by about 9:30. And the guy was really angry with me. He said, "Where have you been? We're just about to call somebody else, man. You can't turn up late for these gigs." It was a street band, but it was a really good street band. Joe Locke on the vibraphone.
Really? Oh man!
He was so good. Great bass player. Randy Johnson on the guitar. Yeah. And different people would do it. Jeff Tane Watts would play the drums a lot. Really? Of the time. I mean, yes, and all around that area, like it was a race to see who could get the spot first. If you were there first, then other people had to move on, Yeah. And so, we get there at 9 o'clock, and already Vincent Herring was standing there with his horn. He'd pinched the spot. He'd been there since 8 o'clock waiting for the cat. So that was the best spot. So, Vincent Herring, he was the street of. He was always on the street playing. Ralph Moore was always busking on the street playing with a really good band with all of the best cats. And in those days, they had the Moose and the Mouse amplifiers. You know what they are? The Moose was the bass one, and the Mouse was the treble one. So if you're a guitarist, you had the Mouse, and if you're bass player, you had the Moose. And so I think it took them 24 hours to charge, and I think the battery supposed to last 12 hours, but it lasted about 8. But it was amazing. So we had acoustic bass players with good shouting amps, and people would wheel out the Fender Rhodes and set it up, and have the Mouse amp there. So it was played until it ran out of juice, and it was an amazing thing. And so the bands were good, man. And all of them. Everybody took all their instruments by subway. So so the drummer would have a tiny little kit that would fit onto one of those extendable trolleys, and he'd take that on the train and set it up, and everybody had their way of dealing with it. But it just meant that everyone was playing all the time, all day, every day. And because it's on the street, we could learn from each other. So the guitarist or the piano player would say, "Hey man, do you know this Monk tune?" I go, "Oh, sort of. How's it go again? What's the bridge do again?" We could discuss tunes and sort of learn them, and then we'd start playing them. And if I stuffed up the melody in the bridge and, you know, had another hit at it, it didn't really matter. This was on the street, but we get, it was amazing. After a while, after about a year after the first year I was there, the bands on the street sounded better than the bands in the clubs, and they were getting paid more money.
Oh man, that's bizarre.
Yeah, it was true. I mean, you know, when I think about all of the cats in all of the bands, and there was many of them playing, you know, Central Park, down by the Cube at down by the Twin Towers there, up at you know, quite a few different locations in town, and people actually had the whole setup and they played great, and it was all the good young players. They're all out there playing. Billy Drummond on the drums, and you know, that whole generation, that Carl Allen, Tony Reedus, they're all there. They're all out there playing on the street because it was good music, and you could really good players. You could play anything you liked, whenever you liked, and for as long as you liked. Yeah. So it was a real, a training. I found it was, for me and for all of the cats there, was a real training experience. You actually got to engage and really play in front of an audience that was discerning. And, you know, the audiences then, it was a lot of tourists, and they form like a circle around you, and they clap all the solos and encourage you. It was like a jazz club. They throw money at you, and, you know, they really dig it. But, you know, a lot of people, they came to New York to check out all the culture, all the music and theatre, and there we were on the street playing. So, you know, they were delighted, and we were delighted too. Sure. And, you know, it was an amazing time. We had Elvin Jones used to come by and sit in with us.
No, seriously?
And yeah, he'd come by and he'd go, "Hey, can I play?" Yeah. And the drummer handed the sticks, and Elvin sat in quite a few times on the street with our little band. Frank Foster is another one. Suddenly came out of the crowd. Yeah, Frank came out of the crowd with his saxophone, and suddenly we'd be playing something, probably Shiny Stockings or something. So, it was really fun, man. It was great. Yeah, I took lessons. I played. I went to all jam sessions. I sat in with everybody I could.
Sure. Yeah.
One thing is, I went up to Harlem a lot. When I was first there, it was strange, but this young, well, same age as me, alto player from Sydney. It was a bit of a crazy dude. The first thing he knew about New York was Harlem, the Blue Book Club. I think it was on 130 something. And so he got me to come up there, and I went up there like 5 nights in a row. I loved it, man. It was an old organ trio. Della Griffin used to play the drums and run the restaurant from behind the drums.
Dale?
You know, Billy Elgart and Wayne Darley.
Oh, man, sure. I did this interview with Billy. I'll send you a link. Yeah, I'll send you a link.
Oh, send me.
Such a nice guy, man.
When I first went to New York, right, to live there, when I first went there, before going to New York, I did a tour of Germany with an Australian guitarist called Peter O'Mara.
Oh, sure, I know. He's in
Sydney
Linz.
Also.
He's in Linz for 40 years.
I thought you would know him. Yes, I've known him since I was a teenager. So we did a couple of records together in Australia when I was very young. And then he moved to Germany. And sooner or later, eventually, he said to me, "Oh, look, he invited me to do a tour." And I thought, well, if I'm going to go over and do a tour of Germany with Peter, I'll probably go on to New York after that. So I did. So after the tour was finished, and I did a few other gigs around Germany with other bands that I picked up. I think I played a few nights up at the Unterfahrt in Munich.
Sure.
And the Jazz Keller in Frankfurt.
Sure. Sure, I know these places.
A few other places, Hamburg. And then, I went to New York from there. But the band that Peter had organised for the tour was Billy Elgart on drums and Wayne Darling on the bass.
Beautiful.
It was absolutely fantastic, man. I thought it was great. I mean, I knew Wayne Darling from a Joe Henderson record called Barcelona. That's and it was great. It was a trio record. I think, but it's so it was just dynamite. It was some of the best Joe Henderson. And Billy Elgar, I knew of from playing with Paul Bley.
Paul Bley, sure.
So yeah, he played with Paul Bley. So it's amazing, and it was the greatest thing, just traveling around with for me at my age, because I hadn't lived in New York by that stage, and just being with Billy and Wayne and talking about their life and times and how they got there, and talking about just their philosophy. Billy's is very philosophical, very deep, spiritual kind of guy. I found he's an amazing character, and I really enjoyed hanging out with Billy and talking to him about many different things, endlessly fascinating. So that's an amazing thing. That was an incredible time in my life. Then after that, I flew to New York and stayed there for a long time, as long as I could, until the money ran out. And even then, I stayed there longer.
Dale, in New York, how did the gig with Cedar Walton happen?
No, yeah, that's right. That was an amazing thing, because I always loved Cedar. I had him on tons and tons of things. I loved his all the recordings. Clifford Jordan and George Coleman, and played with Bob Berg. And I heard the band a few times in New York. Now I moved to London. This is the bizarre thing. I moved to London because my girlfriend at the time was a classical violinist, and she still is. She's still plays with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. But we were boyfriend and girlfriend from Sydney, so we hooked up in New York. She came over, and we lived there for a long time. And then we ran out of money. I think we hadn't paid rent for about 4 months.
Oh, shit.
We hadn't paid the phone bill for a long, long time, and we couldn't pay it because it was in someone else's name. We sorted that out, but we owed lots of money. We had no money. We're totally flat broke. Had nothing. All the furniture we picked up off the street, and I think we had a big bag of rice, a big sack of rice, and a big sack of beans, and that's all we had to eat. I think it was. We didn't have very much. We moved to London, and she had a gig with an orchestra, so I followed along. And London was so strange. It was like moving to a different planet after New York. Everything closed early in those days. Everything shut. It was like the war years. It was like it was like under World War II still. Everything finished early, and it took me ages to adjust to the place. I didn't really like it at first at all. But then I started getting to know everybody, and there was a good scene there. I mean, good players, and there was an interesting history there. And once I got into the scene, I realised it was much better than I originally thought. And there was actually quite a bit of work generated there, close to the continent, and they were big jazz fans. I ended up playing at Ronnie Scott's all the time. There was probably the only place to play. It's about 3 places, but Ronnie Scott's was going strong. And so I got to know Ronnie pretty well. He'd come to Australia a few times. In fact, I played with him. I sat in. I was featured on one of the gigs in Australia in London with Ronnie, and in Australia, sorry, with Ronnie's band. So when I came to London, I knew Ronnie a bit, and I got to know the scene. I got to know all the young cats on the scene, and eventually Ronnie offered me a whole lot of gigs there. They had the feature band, which and they had a local support act. So I was living there, and I assembled my own quartet, which was good, with Django Bates on the piano, and
really? Wow. Steve
Aguilez on drums, and Mick Hutton on the bass.
Oh man, really that's good, beautiful, man. Yeah, these are killing players.
It was a very good band. Yes, very good band, and really good players. And I love that band. It was fantastic. And we did all originals too, mostly my tunes. I wrote quite a few things for that band. It was inspiring. Django wrote some beautiful things. A couple of songs by Mick. But we used to play there all of the time. So that was my quartet at Ronnie. So we do 45, and the main act would play. Then we do another 45. The main act would play, and that was every night for 5 nights or whatever it is. And sometimes I'd play with Ronnie's band. Ronnie would call me up and say, "Dale, what are you doing tonight?" "Oh, I'm watching TV." "Why?" "Do you want to? Can you come in and do the gig for me?" I say, "Well, why don't you do it?" He said, "I'm drunk."
Oh, shit.
I was sitting at the back, but I've had too many drinks. Pistol already. Oh, well, yeah, you come and do it. So I'd often do the gig for Ronnie, and it was a great band with Martin Drew on the drums, Ronnie Matheson on the bass, Dick Pearce on the trumpet, John Critchison on piano, I think, and so I'd often do the gig with Ronnie. I'd often do the gig with my group, a couple of other groups. I did it with. Georgie Fame, I did it once with, but you know, a lot of the groups there did the support act. So I do it a lot with my quartet, sometimes with other people's bands. But the main acts they had were people like the Cedar Walton group or Horace Silver, Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers.
Sure.
You know, more commercial bands too, like Roy Ayers or some of the others, but good bands, you know, all good. And at one stage, Cedar's trio was playing there, and we were doing the support, and Cedar asked me to sit in. Said, "Hey man, why don't you sit in to play a couple of songs with my band?" So I did, I think, the second night, and then the third night I did the same, and the fourth night. So I just played, I think, one or just 2 songs, more and more. I think, and you know, he said to me afterwards, he said, because then he said, "Oh, look, I want to get you for a recording. Let's do a recording, because you know all of my tunes." And I think, I don't know any of his tunes, man. I just heard them on a tape. You know, I just had tapes from Australia that people had made me. I couldn't get hold of the records half the time, so I just had these tapes. So I didn't even know what song was what, but I knew them by ear. So he said to me, "Okay, you know Ojos Rojo?" Sort of, yeah. Okay, let's do it. Give me a note to start on. What's the first note? So he gave me a note. I played it. I wasn't even sure of the form or when to stop. I was sort of really just blindfold, totally blindfold. And then Firm Roots. I knew that from the recording. I could sort of make my way through that, but I didn't really know the tunes. I didn't really know the tunes. But, "Oh, you know all my tunes. You got to join the band and play with my group." So I ended up touring with him, and we did a recording, and later on we did another recordings, 2 different recordings.
That's with Billy Higgins on drums, then, or
with Billy Higgins on the drums. Yeah,
that's amazing. Yeah,
Magic Billy, Smiling Billy. Billy was incredible, man. He was just phenomenal. I mean, look, to me, he was one of the most creative soloists in New York. You know, when I hear him play, I could, it was so exciting. He just drew the audience in, drew me in, drew everybody in. You know, he was so creative and hip, and the nicest, loveliest guy you'd ever play with, and really encouraging, friendly, lovely. So I love touring with, playing with Billy and with Cedar. It's great. David Williams was on the bass at that stage. Sam Jones had passed away, so it was David Williams. And but I think at that stage Bob Berg had left the band. He joined Miles, and so Cedar was playing as a trio a lot of the time. Sometimes with Junior Cook, sometimes with George Coleman. A lot of the time as a trio, but I did a lot of the gigs after that. With Cedar, and I got to know the songs a lot better. It's a trial by fire. It's a good way of getting to know the tunes.
Oh, sure.
Just winging it by ear, just pretending you know what you're doing, but you don't really. Fake it till you make it.
Oh my God. That's
amazing. No, I've done quite a lot of that, but you manage after a while. Cedar was great,
man.
And I remember one night a piano player came up to a friend of mine from Sydney. He'd come to New York, I think, to take lessons, just hang out, listen to a lot of music, and he was there, Tim. He played with Cedar one night, and he came up afterwards. Oh, do you think you could introduce me to Cedar? I'd love to take a lesson. I said, sure. So after the set had finished, I said, Cedar, this is a young piano player from Australia, Alistair. He'd really like to take. He's a good player, and he'd really like to take lessons with you. And Cedar said, oh man, I'd love to, but did you hear the way I played polka dots and moonbeams? I couldn't remember the bridge. I totally stuffed it up. I played terrible chords. I messed the whole thing up, man. And I did it again when the bridge came around again. You don't want to take lessons with a guy that plays that bad. You don't want to take lessons with me. But you're Cedar Walton. I've heard you say, oh, no, I'm not good. I'm not good enough to take lessons with, though. I wouldn't know what to teach you. You can probably play the piano better than me anyway. Eventually, he did give him a lesson. It was a great lesson, apparently. It's like the lessons I took with Joe Henderson. They'd go on for days.
How was that like?
Oh, it was great, man. He's a musician. He loves jazz and he loves playing. He's so enthusiastic and excited about it. It's fantastic. And so, I'd ask him about something and he'd be on the piano for like an hour and then he'd get me to play the piano and he'd play. And we just, it's like suddenly the sun would be going down. And he'd still be going. He just loved it, man. He loved music, and he wanted to talk about all kinds of things and all the things he'd been checking out and listening to. And he was dynamite, man. He was fantastic. What a great guy, an incredible musician. I was just in awe. Not only that, when I got back to Australia, when I finally moved back to Australia, I had I think about 3 or 4 different students of mine, and they said, "Oh, Dale, I think you know Joe Henderson, don't you? He's one of my favourite saxophone players." I said, "Yeah. I mean, he's great. He's a fantastic player. I love him to death." And they said, "Well, do you think you could organise for me to take a lesson from him?" I go, "Oh, it's Joe Henderson. He's touring and he's busy, and I don't know. It's up to him, really." But next time I talk to him, I'll ask him. And Joe was the sort of guy that loved talking on the phone, right? You'd call him up and you'd have like a 3-hour conversation with him while he was making the soup and, anything. He loved that. He loved chatting on the phone. He's a lovely bloke. And I said to him, Joe, look, I've got a couple of students here, and they all love you playing, as everyone does, but they were hoping to they asked me to ask you if it was okay if they took lessons from you. He said, yeah, sure, I'll send them over. So the first guy I sent over, because he was living in San Francisco, that place there. And I said to this guy afterwards, Anthony, how was the lessons with Joe Henderson? Oh, it's great, man. I stayed at his house for 2 weeks.
Oh shit!
I didn't never stay at Joe Henderson's house for 2 weeks. He was my student, and you go over to stay at his house for 2 weeks. Man, that's one of the best things you could do. That's fantastic.
That's incredible.
So, wonderful, man. Yeah.
But
yeah, with Cedar, that's how I got the gig. Basically, I think I was recommended by Ronnie, and Cedar knew that I'd come from New York. All the English guys knew that I'd been in New York for a couple of years or more, 3 years or something. And I was playing with people in New York, and when I moved to England, they helped me get gigs and stuff. So that's sort of how I hooked up with Cedar. And when eventually I moved back to New York after that, there were more opportunities, and eventually got the gig with the Jazz Messengers.
Yeah, how did that happen with Art? How did the gig with Art?
Well, that was a bizarre one too. Yeah, that was bizarre because I knew all the musicians in the band. Essiott Oakhorn Essiott was a good friend of mine way before he was in the Messengers, and he just joined the Messengers. And then who else? Oh, Charles Famborough. I got to know Charles Famborough very well, and he was with one of the early versions of the Messengers. when Winton Marsalis was in the band, all those cats. And I knew Valerie Ponomarev. I knew Benny Green pretty well from when I was first there. I mean, we had a gig. We had a band. It was bizarre. It was Branford on alto, Valerie on the trumpet. I played tenor sometimes, and there was a Japanese bass player. And we played. What did we play again? I think we played Barry Harris's Cultural Theatre on 28th Street.
Oh wow, man!
And we played 7th Avenue South a couple of times.
Yeah,
but and once or twice uptown somewhere. But I knew Benny very well, so that was good. And eventually, Charles Famber said to me, "Hey, Dale, I think Art's looking for a new tenor player, and I suggested you. So do you want to join the band?" "Oh yeah, man! Wow, are you kidding me? You think he'd like my playing? You think he said, "Oh yeah, man, you should go. You should just go and play with the band." And he said, "I'll take you around. I'll take you around to his crib. I'll tell you it's downtown, not too far from where you live." So he came around to my pad, and we caught a taxi to Art's place, and everybody came to Art's place. It was a hangout. You know, it was like the Messengers was like a tribe. You know, it was the former Messengers, new Messengers, or just friends. There's lots of friends. It was like this great big bunch of people hanging out together all the time, like a big posse. So we went around there, and there was, I'd walk in, and there was all these cats just hanging around, talking, laughing, smoking, drinking, eating food, and they'd be there all day. I didn't recognize half of them, but there'd be sometimes Bobby Watson, McCoy Tyner, Dizzy Gillespie. They'd all come and hang too. It was amazing because they were all mates of Art's, and if they're in town, they'd want to say hello and pay their respects and just hang out with him. He was a great guy. But there we went around to his place, and I walked in. Charles said, "Oh, this is the Australian saxophone player that I told you about." I said, "Oh man, welcome. Where's your horn?" I said, "Oh well, we're just hanging out in the village. I didn't know that you expect me to bring on." I said, "Yeah, man, I want to hear you play. Can you go home and get it?" I just walked in the door, and I was walking out the door, and caught a taxi back to my pad, grabbed the horn, and caught a taxi back, and I knocked on the door, and he opened the door. "Hey, man, you're back again. You got the horn this time?" And I said, "Yeah, I got the horn." Yeah, he said, "Whoa, pull it out, start playing." It was like a split level apartment on the top of the building. It was like a penthouse thing, and he had a terrible white baby grand piano. It sounded horrible, but it was it was white and looked nice on the floor, But he said, "Oh, just plays." I said, "What do you want me to play?" "I was anything. So I pulled out the horn and just started playing. I can't even remember what I was, just fishing my way through some tune I'd chosen, just playing bits and pieces. And I think I played a ballad and blew over it for a little while, and just some other stuff. And I thought, oh, it's been about half an hour so far. When you're playing saxophone by yourself for half an hour, it feels like an eternity. It was like forever. So I sort of took it out of my mouth, and he came and said, "Oh man, don't stop now. No, everybody's digging this, man. They're digging it. No, don't stop." So I kept going, and after a while, I sort of stopped, and then he came up and said, "Hey man, do you write any songs? Do you write any tunes?" I said, yeah, I write those tunes. He said, "Well, play some on the piano." So he made me hop on the piano and play through some of my compositions. And again, I was sitting there for about an hour maybe, and I thought, well, have I written any more songs? I think I've played them all. What do I do next? I'll just fiddle around with some sounds and some of the things I'm working on and see where they end up. And so I just started playing and improvising over whatever I was playing the left hand, and going from one thing to another, and after a while he came and said, "Oh, that's good, man. Are they all your tunes?" I said, yeah, they're all my tunes. Yeah, the songs I wrote. "Oh, good. Well, look, come along this week and sit in at Sweet Basil's, because we're doing a week there with the band. I want you to come in. Come every night and sit in." I said, "Really?" He said, yeah, come in every night, man. Last set, you can play the whole last set. So, oh, that's great. So I went along and I sat in for the last set, and every night after a week, it was funny, man. It was like a Sunday, because the Saturday's the last night you play at Sweet Basil's. Now I think they had Doc Cheatham or something, always on Sundays. So on the Sunday, he calls me and said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm just hanging at home. Come over. So I said, okay. So I come over, and as usual, the whole posse hanging out there. Everyone's asking around, all talking, laughing. Someone's cooking some soup in the corner. I said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, tomorrow, it's Monday. Oh, the most said, we're doing a tour of Europe. We're leaving tomorrow. You're in the band. We want you to join. I said, really? Tomorrow? I said, yeah, tomorrow. And of course, I didn't have a green card or anything at that stage. I just had, it was an Australian passport. So it was pretty strange for me. Well, maybe I don't know my state. I'm not an American citizen or anything. It might require a bit of. I said, my manager, he's German. He's really good. He knows exactly what he's doing. He will sort out everything for him. That's what I pay him for. So I go, okay. So they all. I think I got there 2 days late. But eventually I did the tour, and that was the first time I played with the Messengers. Was actually, apart from New York, was in Europe. So we travelled everywhere in Europe, and we did that a couple of times, 2 different years, and we played in the States, lots of different places as well. But I was sort of in the band from that point. I made 2 records with the band. Chipping In and One for All.
One for All, yeah.
I got one of my songs, Bunyip, which is a mythical Aboriginal Australian creature. That was it. And then he passed away not long after. He was pretty old, but it was amazing. It was his 70th birthday. We did the 70th birthday tour, and I've still got the jacket, the Art Blakey touring jacket. Art Blakey's 70th birthday tour, and the tour lasted much longer than a year. He really milked it. He really did. But it was great for all of us young guys.
Oh, sure.
On the tour of Europe, and I think Japan too. Yeah, Japan and around the States, we had Benny Golson, Jackie McLean, and Curtis Fuller.
Yeah, I saw that on YouTube. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah,
man, it was amazing. Just hang out with those guys and just talking with them, and all of the stories and hearing about the, what life was like for them back then and in the day, and how and how they got into the scene and how they started.
Yeah,
man, it was just fascinating. I mean, they because in those days they didn't have anything, right? They couldn't. It reminded me of my father's generation.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, yeah. It was like in my father's generation, nobody knew how to teach it. They said, you either got it or you ain't. If you pick up the saxophone, you sound good. So, yeah, that's good. Just keep doing what you're doing.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Well, any other tips? Oh, no, just that. Just keep doing that. Whatever you're doing, just keep doing that. Oh, here's a couple of records to listen to. Have you heard this guy, Sonny Stitt? Have you heard this guy, Sonny Rollins? Or check this guy out. And so they get you to listen to various things, but no, they didn't really know what to say. Everybody just did it their own way and just sort of did it by ear, and. I remember talking to Jackie, it was really interesting. He said, well, how did you learn, man? There was like nothing on paper. There was no transcribed solos or any, there's no instructional anything. There were no jazz courses. And so how did you work it all out? And he said, just the same as anyone else did. He said when Charlie Parker first started came on the Radio City Music Hall broadcast, he said, I strapped the radio to my ear, and I had the horn right there. So anything he played, I could try to play it straight away if I heard it on the radio. And then there'd be another thing, and I'd try to play that straight away. And then So that's how you really learn. Oh yeah, that's how, and you know, when Charlie Parker played, we'd all gather around the air vent on the street, all the young kids. We didn't have money to go in, and we'd really struggle to try to listen to everything. And then, you know, I'd struggle to hear everything was playing. When I got home that night, I'd get the saxophone out late at night and quietly I'd try to play something like I think what I heard him playing.
Man, yeah.
And I got the idea that, well, there's only 12 keys, so if I learn everything in 12 keys, I'll be able to do a ton of different. You know, there's certain obvious things in music, of course, that would occur to you after a while. And so I learned to play and all. Yeah, I did all of that, and I got to know Bird, and you know, Bird. I said, well, how did Bird help you? I said, oh, a bit the same. He just said, oh yeah, sound good, man. Just keep doing what you're doing. Nobody had any instruction. Nobody knew what the hell they were doing back in those days. And it was that's a nice thing, because it means you have to use your own imagination. You have to be yourself. And I think maybe that's part of why a lot of the musicians from that generation
were so original.
They've got their own sound and their own approach, and you know, it really sounds like them. Maybe because they had no choice. Yeah,
definitely.
they had to, you know, there's no choice but to be yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
which is the ultimate choice we all have anyway. Yeah. You know.
Amazing. Yeah. Man, that's amazing, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that was great touring with the Messengers and hanging out with all those guys. It was wonderful. And that led to a whole lot of other new things and various other gigs with other people. But yeah, wonderful times. Yeah, it's funny, you know, because I suppose when I started traveling around the world, people, you know what it's like yourself. If somebody wants to advertise you, they cherry pick all of the names you've played with.
Sure.
So, you know, I've got doing some gig in Europe. They go, it'd say Dale Barlow, and underneath it you go Cedar Walton, Art Blakey, Gil Evans, Dizzy Gillespie, Chet Baker. That's all. So it doesn't say anything. I mean, it looks like they're a member of my band. But you know, it's sort of, and in Japan too. You know, they have like the names that who I played with.
Oh, sure.
And my name, and then the name, but that's it. You know, it's like it's the only thing they're really interested in. But to be honest, as you know, going to the States and playing in New York, particularly, there's so many great players that nobody has ever heard of before that are as good as anybody. That just the talent level, I think that surprises everybody. It was certainly a shock to me that, you know, players that I'd never heard of before. And I said, wow, man, you sound so good. Do you have any recordings? Oh, no, I haven't had anything like that. No. Oh, man, you're one of the best players I've ever heard. Where can I get recordings? Oh, no, I haven't done any recordings. There's so many players like that. Yeah. Piano players that were so good and nobody's ever heard of them. Just incredible players. And so many drummers, but on every instrument. It was just shocking to me that there were so many good players. So when I think about it, you know, despite the well-known bands I've played with, there's so many that I think were really important to my musical development, and I love that nobody's really ever heard of before.
Yeah, bizarre. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's the same with everybody in a way. I remember, was it Miles? And another interview with Ornette Coleman, but an interview with Miles, and they said, who was an old one, and who did you listen to? Who did you really like? And he mentioned a whole lot of people that I'd never heard of before. Ornette Coleman mentioned like about 5 or 6 names of really influential players, and I'd never heard of any of them before. So, you know, it was obviously not the first time in history that it ever happened. I think it was a common thing. But just surprisingly, the level of talent in a place like New York was for me spectacular.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, I know. Yeah, it's bizarre. Well, I remember first time I came from Slovenia to New York, and you know, I opened the paper, Village Voice or the All About Jazz or what it was. I don't know. New York, yeah. And there was like every night, you know, like 60 listings for jazz concerts, and I was like, "Are you kidding me?" It was who in jazz playing, you know. I
couldn't believe it. Like I think the first night I I was in New York living there, I think I heard just 7 different groups, and they were all like really famous bands that you couldn't possibly listen to that many well-known bands anywhere else in the world.
Sure.
Exactly. You'd look in the back of the Village Voice, and there'd be Joe Henderson playing the same night as Freddie Hubbard.
Yeah.
The same night there'd be Horace Silver's band playing. The same night there'd be, all these great players everywhere. You couldn't possibly see all of the good bands that were playing in one night. Although often I try.
Yeah, amazing, man. It's
just fantastic. Yeah, just amazing. I thought.
Otherwise, Dale, what are you up to these days? I mean, like, as a leader, I know you've done stuff in the past. I have that record with Essiet and Eddie Henderson from 91, and beautiful music you wrote. But I wanted to ask you nowadays, are you still writing and leading bands? And
yes and no. Yeah, I've actually got a band. Well, the coronavirus really changed everything.
Yeah.
And, for the last 3 years or whatever it's been a little bit more difficult to do what I love to do. But now there's more gigs, and I get asked quite frequently here to put my own band together and with my originals. So that's happening more and more now than it ever did before.
Okay.
For the last 3 years. So I'm doing that. I've had invites to other countries to play, but there's problems traveling now, so I'm a little bit reluctant. But there's plenty of things here. There's actually a pretty good scene here. The funny thing is about Bangkok, it's there were lots of jazz clubs before, and there's still quite a lot going. Still quite a few gigs, and nice clubs and good audiences and good musicians. There are 3 jazz courses here, 3 universities just in Bangkok.
Oh, wow.
The king of Thailand was a jazz alto saxophone player, the last king of Thailand, and he was, I think, the longest reigning monarch in the world. 70 years old. 70 years he reigned in Thailand, and he was born in America, believe it or not. And I played with him once when I was touring through here. He had lots of different bands, some English. Whoever was coming through played for the king at one stage. I think they had a concert once a month at the Royal Palace, and I played there for him at one point, and he played the saxophone and he played soprano. And afterwards, we talked to him, and he's a really nice guy. And I said, "Well, how'd you get into jazz?" He said, I learnt from lots of, I was in the States during a pivotal time. I used to go and hear Charlie Parker all the time. I used to go and hear Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. I mean, he was around at that pivotal time. So he, heard all of these incredible bands. And it's the king of Thailand. When they built a new building here, they would put up a great big thing covering the entire building with the king with an alto saxophone around his neck.
Oh, wow, man. That's so cool.
Seriously, man. Seriously. He wrote a lot of songs and still played as TV themes on Thai TV. So, that's had a profound influence on Thai culture. And I think that's one reason why I have a jazz program at all the 3 major universities here.
Amazing.
Because of the king. So there's quite an active jazz scene, and there's some very, very good young players now that I think are really really good. So I've had a lot of those. I've had a few of those cats in the band, and there's an American drummer. There's an African guy that I've been playing with. He's a great jazz player, and he's lived here for years. He plays the drums a lot with my band, and I'm always writing originals. I'm always writing new tunes. Anything that I like, any sound that I like that I can find on the piano that sounds good. If it's a nice melody or something, I always try to develop that into a vehicle for improvisation. I think, that sounds good. I don't want to overcomplicate. I just want to keep it in that mood, in that groove, in that vibe. Where could it go in the bridge? Ooh, it could go here. So I develop them in the simplest way I can. You know, I try to write songs, I guess these days, particularly that are that you can just sing to somebody and they can play it. They don't have to always pull out a chart and read it. You know, something that's singable, that's simple enough and familiar enough for them to just be able to memorize or you know, carve up after just a couple of choruses. You know, they know it really well. I know it back to front after those sort of things. I kind of try to write things like that because they're very user friendly for the musicians. You know, they always play good on them. You know, if it's something that's got something familiar about it, something nice that's easy to get with, and they you know, they get into that groove, they find their way through it.